And if that is the definition of the proletariat, then you have a large number of people that need to be organized. For example, the delivery workers around Manhattan, thousands of them, they are part of the proletariat. And if the delivery workers go on strike, we'd be in real difficulty in the city. They have a lot of potential power. The taxi drivers, well, actually the taxi drivers do have a union right now in New York City. It's a very interesting organization. It tends not to go on strike and do those things, but on the other hand, it's very good to have the taxi drivers in some form of organization. But they're crucial to the operation of the city. And again, organizing, but the left has not got round to the idea of organizing the drivers, organizing the taxi drivers is part of what real politics is about. I still get preached to by the Trotskyists who kind of saying, I don't understand the concept of the proletariat. And I kind of say, I do, but my concept of the proletariat is radically different from yours. And I think you are missing out on what the proletariat it really is. And so that I think the question then arises, which I've been discussing, how do you organize a whole city? What kind of political organization could really start to say, all right, we are going to actually occupy this city, in which the majority of the citizens will actually take political power in a city and start to actually redefine how that city works around different principles than those which are given by the real estate organization and the bankers and all the rest of it. You know, would that be possible? People say, oh, but that's impossible. But then people said it was impossible about early unionization. I think actually a certain unity around this idea of organizing a whole city is critical. And if I go back in history, I'd say, you know, the kind of people who recognized the significance of that were people like Gramsci, because what Gramsci did was to kind of suggest that, yeah, when you organize a trades council in the factory is about a very small segment of society. When you organize in a neighborhood, you're actually organizing the proletariat as a whole, and you have a better understanding of what the needs of the proletariat as a whole are through neighborhood organizing than you do through the organizing of just a single factory through a trades council. So I think we need on the left to have a different vision of what is the proletariat, how the proletariat might mobilize, and how we might actually start to put things together. Much of the city cannot be organized along conventional trade union lines. It's very difficult to organize delivery workers through conventional union lines. You can't organize taxi drivers through conventional unionizing lines. You have to actually come up with a different form of organization. And some of those organizations are being defined by right to the city movements in various ways. Some of these organizations are also emerging out of cultural activities, through occupations of housing, through occupations of cultural facilities. So there's a lot of movement going on in cities, and one of the ambitions I think we should all have is to start to think about organizing the city as a whole, and really then trying to make the city function in a very different way with different facilities. I mean, and part of what people, of course, are striking for and concerned about and agitating for in this country is urban transportation. And I think urban transportation is a critical kind of question. And again, you have to think not about a particular neighborhood when you're thinking about that. You have to think about the system of transport as a whole. And there are forms of organization which have been set up which do that. There is something called the Bus Drivers Union or Bus Riders Union in Los Angeles, which has been very, very powerful in affecting the policies of the transit authority by pointing out that the transit authority only occupies certain routes which serve certain interests, particularly those of upper-income commuters, and doesn't serve the interests of other groups in the community. And so this is, again, a form of agitation which is citywide and which is about the qualities of life within the city as a whole. Again, I think that this is where we live and where we work, and a unified approach to that has always been part of my theoretical concern, and I've had a great deal of resistance from Marxists in particular over trying to integrate concerns over what's going on in a neighborhood with what's going on in a factory, and saying that there's a unity here which we have to cultivate as part of the political process. I think the nature of the struggles that have erupted over the last few years indicate that this is a time when urban life is in fact one of the central focuses of struggle. And therefore we should be prepared to embrace that as, from a Marxist perspective, as being, well, this is where, if you like, the cutting edge of a lot of political agitation is, and we therefore have to be prepared to say that these are the agents of political transformation. And it's going to be people like the taxi drivers and the delivery workers and the domestic workers and the like, who are absolutely significant in this process.
Você poderia comentar pouco sobre a sua crítica? Se você poderia comentar pouco sobre sua crítica ao legado de Hegel na obra de Marx. No começo dos Limites do Capital, você comenta a ideia de noções, de leituras abstratas da teoria marxiana, descartando-as. Você poderia, então, abordar pouco essa temática da sua leitura de Marx, depurada de Hegel?
Well, I never liked Hegel, and I think when people approach Marx and try and understand him, there are various ways of doing it, and I try to make clear that my way of doing it is just one way of doing it. I'm not very interested in trying to reconstruct all the philosophical roots of his arguments. I'm not very interested in trying to reconstruct his relationship to Hegel, his relationship to Spinoza, his relationship to classical German philosophy in general, because frankly I never enjoyed what I started to read of German classical philosophy. And besides, my project was always different, and I suppose my project has both strengths and weaknesses. The strength of it is that I've never accepted any of Marx's propositions that didn't work for me in trying to understand urbanization. If it doesn't work for me, if I can't use it practically in understanding what happened in Second Empire Paris or what was going on in Baltimore, I kind of go, well, why do we hang on to something that plainly does not work? Now, in Limits to Capital, I felt pretty constrained not to get too critical of Marx, and to kind of just try to present what it was that Marx said. So there's not too much of me sort of saying, well, this doesn't work. But in my own, engagement, it doesn't, if it doesn't work, I don't use it. For example, in the category of rent, which is very important, Marx has a category of absolute rent, which I always had difficulty of understanding, and in the end I decided was, basically redundant. It didn't work. The categories of rent that work for me are differential rent and monopoly rent. And I found myself sort of playing around. But my decision about whether to keep with monopoly rent and differential rent, but to throw out absolute rent, was based on the fact that I couldn't find any way in which the concept of absolute rent could help me understand anything whatsoever that was going on in urban land and property markets. So I don't accept those things in Marx that don't work at that kind of level. Which means that my Marx is much more grounded in the applications, but it's not an application of Marx that kind of makes reality conform to Marx. There's been a perpetual dialogue between the two, that I will throw out any Marxist concept that doesn't work in terms of my urban inquiries. So I think, but at the same time, I will reformulate my understanding of urban processes through theoretical considerations. So there's a dialogue that's always gone on between what's going on practically in Baltimore housing markets and in Baltimore in general, or what went on in Second Empire Paris, and how I read Capital. I don't spend my time reading Capital looking for connections to Hegel and Spinoza and all the rest of it. I think it's fine that people do. And I'm sure that there are very more important understandings that can come out of that, and I read some of these, and sometimes they're very helpful, and sometimes they're not. My principal complaint about the Marxists, and particularly Marxists with philosophical leanings, is that they end up making Marx much more complicated than he already is. And it becomes extremely difficult to understand. I mean, if you tell me I cannot understand Marx until I've read all of Hegel, and I can't understand Hegel till I've read all of the Greek philosophers, you know, well, come on. This is a silly kind of position to take. So yeah, I try to understand Marx in relationship to that world I'm looking at. I try to recognize that, okay, there certainly is a strong influence of Hegel. My own conclusion is it's nowhere near as strong as those philosophers who've studied the connection say it is. But I would not want to argue with them about that. If they can show that's fine. But I think the thing that comes to me about this, I will suggest that if we want to make Marx understandable to as broad an audience as possible, then the last thing in the world you want to do is to start spending a lot of time talking about Hegel. And to the degree that, as shown by the companions to Volume 1 of Capital and Volume 2 of Capital now, and the lectures on Marx's Capital and so on, I think the way I read Capital is much more open and practical, and therefore much more useful to people on a daily basis than a reading of Capital that spent a great deal of time articulating what the relationship is between Marx and Hegel. And I think that the popularity of some of the presentations that I've been able to give on Marx through the website and also through the texts, I think shows that there is a way in which we can simplify Marx's arguments, and we can, in fact, do so without having to talk about Hegel all of the time.
Uma das autoras da coletânea Cidades Rebeldes, a urbanista Raquel Ronick, disse num debate de lançamento do livro em São Paulo que o tema da corrupção, muitas vezes evocado em manifestações ou supostamente evocado em manifestações aqui no Brasil, é um tema besta, é uma besteira. Segundo ela, o que políticos corruptos embolsam ilegalmente é uma migalha perto do real problema, que seria a forma legal, mas ilegítima, com a qual empresas nos setores imobiliário, de transporte, privatizam o que é público. Numa entrevista publicada essa semana, HARVEY falou de como o poder institucional em si se tornou refém do poder econômico. HARVEY, você poderia discutir um pouco essa questão? Você também menciona a ideia de democracia totalitária, que vivemos numa democracia totalitária, e a Raquel Ronick fala que a ideia de que políticos são todos corruptos, que é uma ideia muito propagada pela mídia, seria, na verdade, uma ideia partidária da, entre aspas, democracia direta do capital, que existiria aí em detrimento das pessoas.
Yeah, corruption is a kind of market. And actually, in many situations, corruption makes the market work better rather than distorting it. I think, actually, it might be interesting to legalize corruption along with marijuana. And there's an interesting reason for this, that actually the boundary between corruption and legal practices is so porous. And I don't think there's, and then that raises the question of how much we obey the law. There's nobody in this audience who hasn't violated the law. And we're all, and if you have to fill out income taxes like we have to do, well, you play games with things. Everybody does.